Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I wanted to check back in with Scott Beyer, who is the founder of an organization called the Market Urbanism Report. Really interesting gentleman. I've interviewed him a couple times before, once on just his sort of free market policies in regards to cities and urbanism and development. But I caught up with him when he was in the middle of a trip through South America last year. He's on this global tour of developing cities around the world. And we've caught him as he's halfway through his trip. He's finished South America, and on Tuesday, he's off to South Africa. Scott, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Brian.
Thanks so much for coming back. I want you to, first off, tell us a little bit about market urbanism. I understand your main purpose is to discuss how free market policies work in cities, and you double somewhat as a professional network for planners, architects, real estate developers, activists, politicians, think tankers, urban residents, and anyone else interested in cities. Tell me about how you got this group going and why.
Yeah, so market urbanism is a theory that's actually been around a while. I'm not the only one who champions it, but it calls for the cross between free market policy and urban issues. How can city challenges be addressed through a classical liberal perspective of smaller government, private sector outcomes, empowering the individual to make their own decisions, and how that interplays with the larger concept of a city where a city. Yeah, so it's a theory that tries to apply classical liberal economic ideas to specifically urban issues like housing and transportation. Market Urbanism Report is just a media company that I started in a think tank that designs to elevate the market urbanism idea into the larger discourse about cities.
And you're now launched on a global tour of developing cities. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was based in the U.S. and had covered U.S. urban issues as a journalist for about 8 years. And I thought the next step in my education would be to travel around the world and visit particularly developing market cities which grow a lot faster than the Western ones, quote unquote. So I'm on a 1.5 year tour where I spent 5 months in Latin America. That's already complete. And I'm going to spend another 6 months in Africa in 2023. And then the final 6 months of 2023 is in Asia.
Sounds fantastic. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you learned, what you toured, who you saw, what you saw in South America. Is that right?
Yeah, and not just South America, but I'd say all of Latin America, because I went to a lot of Central American countries as well.
And we'll go through some of the places in more detail after our message break. But were there some general learnings that came out of your Latin America trip?
I'd say the general learnings is that the urbanism is quite good down there, and I think that we in the Western world have a lot to learn from them, particularly in respect to how they use their public realm, how they embrace the idea of urban growth. So there's more of an enthusiasm about allowing urban density and transit-oriented development into their cities, but then also softening that with better placemaking so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And we can get more into detail, but that was my general takeaway, is that they grew at a different time, and they grew with a different mindset than a lot of Western societies that prioritize the automobile. And so, yeah.
That's interesting. So you're saying that they're open to greater density in transit-oriented developments, but they do something with their public realm to make it less negative, less impactful, less negatively impactful. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say there were 13 specific neighborhoods that I found And we talked about this the last time, but I have a more developed version of it at this point. We talked about the idea of the barrio tropical. Yeah, I got really interested in the idea as I was traveling of barrio tropicales, and that is Spanish for tropical neighborhood. And I find that the best, most wealthy neighborhoods in any given big LATAM city is it. Not only do they focus on things like multimodal street design and density and kind of a neo-traditional urban style, but they also we have neighborhoods like that in the US and Canada. But what they do differently is they plant a lot of plants and trees so that it has, and they really leverage the local botany to make the neighborhood look lush and kind of jungle-like. So if you go to a barrio tropical, and an example I could use is Leblon in Rio de Janeiro, that was my favorite one. They would have all kinds of parks and medians and street trees that are very mature and well grown and kind of hover over the whole street, making an umbrella shadow over the whole street. And so that's one aspect of the barrio tropical, is it's a commitment by the city government to turn their public realm into something that seems very lush and tropical. But then the second leg of that was the role that the private sector plays in this. So a lot of like restaurants and storefronts and apartment buildings in these types of neighborhoods will also add a lot of lush greenery to their public realm. Yeah, there we go. That's Leblon. And because they're all trying to compete with each other to be the most attractive to the consumer. So all put together, it kind of creates, like, between the public and private investment in these neighborhoods, it creates a very tropical setting.
So a lot more vegetation in urban environments.
Yes. And the criticism that I've gotten is, oh, well, it's Latin America and it's not hard for them because of the natural climate. It's not hard for them to create a public realm like this. But I mean, there's a lot that can be said to that. The main one being that quite a lot of the US, like most of the US South and Sunbelt and even southern parts of California, are subtropical, and we grow some of the same type of vegetation. But I think ultimately it's a policy choice, and it's a cultural mindset, because I cannot think of one single barrio tropical that exists anywhere in the United States, and yet Florida, for example, would be a right place where this could be tried. But I just don't think there's the same commitment to placemaking that exists in Latin America.
Fascinating. This experience that you've had traveling around Latin America must have just been incredible. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Scott Beyer after the message and talk a little bit more about his travels, about the cities that he's been to, about some of the learnings that that have resulted from his trip. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Scott Beyer, who is the founder, publisher, company owner of an organization called the Market Urbanism Report. And it's an interesting philosophy, the Market Urbanism Report. They apply sort of neoclassical liberal attitudes, economics, to cities. A lot of people think that, it's sort of control and lots of zoning and planning that have created cities. And I guess what Scott's doing is he's trying to talk about how more free market attitudes have created cities. Scott did a lot of study of who was it that wrote that famous book from Toronto on organic growth in cities. And some people thought that she was all about the planning and zoning, but actually what she said is that the best cities worldwide were the ones that grew organically.
Yeah, who is who? Oh, you're talking about Jane Jacobs.
Exactly, Jane Jacobs,
Yes, yes,
who
yeah. You
moved from
said from
Manhattan.
Toronto.
Moved from
I
Toronto moved from Manhattan to Toronto, and most people credit her as being one of the people, along with actually a gentleman by the name of David Crombie, the former mayor of Toronto, who stopped expressways that were going to be bisecting the cities and created some beautiful communities, or allowed the beautiful communities to stay around. But I think that it's interesting that many people have thought that government regulation has been keys to creating great cities. And what you're suggesting is that no, maybe some free market liberal, small liberal policies have actually been some of the successful ones.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the small time entrepreneurship and the bottom up growth is actually what creates cities, and throughout history, and that they oftentimes work in spite of the government planning. And so there's been a zeal for top down planning that dates back to Haussmann and Paris, and really materialized throughout the progressive era in the United States, and ultimately led to things like urban renewal and slum demolition and highway construction. But I think the market urbanism critique is that a lot of those top-down infrastructure impositions were a failure and actually hurt cities, and we're looking for a more bottom-up traditional way of path to urban growth.
And did you find that in your Latin American tour?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, is that Latin America grew in an earlier stage, but pre-automobile, and it grew without some of the central planning that you might find in the Western world, because there was simply less money for things like urban renewal. And so what ended up happening is they saved a lot of their cherished, or they never demolished in the first place, a lot of their cherished civic institutions in best neighborhoods. And so a lot of the best neighborhoods, the timeless ones that have been adequate for people for centuries, never got demolished. And so it's a different way of living from the overscaled, spread out way that we do in the West.
So you actually had a post here as your final 10 takeaways from Latin America. Maybe you could share with us what your final 10 takeaways were from your trip through Latin America.
Well, yeah, there's been three. I think the main thing to talk about would be the three real estate genres that I'm really interested in. And so we already went over one of them, Barrio Tropical, the idea that you take these classical neighborhoods and plant a lot of trees and plants and flowers to make them look jungle-like and tropical. So that's one of them. Another one that I'm very interested in is the idea of startup cities, because that fits very much into the market urbanism aesthetic. A lot of the idea behind startup cities is that if traditional municipal government-run cities are malfunctioning, if they have high taxes and high regulations and poor services and a poor overall quality of life, have private companies build new cities that are for profit, that are managed by the company and by perhaps a board of investors, and see if that becomes a good alternative to the government city. And so that's kind of what I'm traveling around the world to see a lot of these types of places. But in Latin America specifically, I visited 10 different startup cities, and as a general rule, they are formed on the edge of town, usually 10 or 20 miles outside of a big city. And they're much smaller, and they're kind of like an HOA on steroids, but there's a lot more to them than that. But the idea being that it's an alternative model of governance.
And for some reason, you're saying that these startup cities where private capital, private interests are controlling the city do better than government democratic regulation?
That is what I'm saying.
Really?
Or at least in the case of the ones that I saw. I mean, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, because some of the startup cities aren't even built yet. They're getting built. And so when I went out and visited them, it would just be like a big green field with a bunch of denuded dirt. And so you can't make conclusions about something like that. But one comparison I could give you, in Guatemala City, there was a development called Cayala, which was built on new urbanism principles, and it had a lot of interesting things that you wouldn't see in a normal city. Like, for example, they put all the car and parking infrastructure underground. So the grade level of the city was entirely pedestrian oriented without cars. And what I found interviewing the people in Cayala and in Guatemala City is that Cayala is a destination, and it's a place that people in the city seek out because it's safer. You're not having to deal with rude drivers who are going to run you over. You're not having to deal with criminals because there's much more private security in Cayala. And so it became a model that people who have to live in Guatemala City actually seek out. And I think private governance has a lot to do with that.
Sounds like a fascinating experience.
Yeah, and I think the startup city, private city thing is relatively new, and it's gaining traction around the world. And so I think it'll be interesting to see in the next 10 to 20 years of these big initiatives that often have, 9-figure funding behind them. Of these big initiatives, which ones work, which ones don't, which ones go bankrupt, which ones really flourish. But the good part is that it's a form of diversity and experimentation, and it presents an alternative to this idea that we need, completely democratic run cities that operate on the public vote and operate on, government management.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I was involved in a development in Florida called Celebration that was effectively that in North America. And so some people think it was one of the best city developments around. This is kind of interesting. I've noticed this post that you made about developments around stadiums, and you're talking about Buenos Aires, and that there's not parking, but it's a street mall. And then someone commented that it's only because of the transit availability that allows this to occur. Tell me about what you saw in regards to stadiums and the different way that stadiums are developed and surrounded in Latin America.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not, I can't say that all of Latin America has any one blueprint, but this specific stadium in La Boca, Argentina, for Boca Juniors Soccer Club, Diego Maradona, you see his insignia up in the top left of the photo. But yeah, that stadium specifically was plopped in a very urban neighborhood. And so rather than the traditional US model where you have huge parking lots where people tailgate, the party around the stadium actually takes place in an urban neighborhood. And so there's much more of a public realm there, and much more diversity of retail. I thought it was quite interesting.
It is a trend when you think about, LA Live and some of the other developments where they're trying to create around stadiums very urban environments with a lot of shopping and restaurants and whatnot, rather than just the big parking lot. So maybe we could learn something from these other examples.
Yeah, and the tide is kind of shifting in some cases. Like at this point, there are several dozen examples I could point to in the US of new stadiums getting built that are more urban. The Seattle football stadium, I'm blanking on the name, but both their football and baseball stadium are in this little cluster just on the edge of downtown that kind of has an urban aesthetic around it. But I had never seen anything like La Boca. I had never seen anything like it, where that thorough of a urban neighborhood was surrounding the stadium, and there was almost no parking. That was the interesting thing. There was no parking that I could find. And to the commenter's point, that's what happens when you have a great mass transit system, and Argentina does have that.
You've got another comment here about mass transit, and I'll read it. You won't realize the failure that is New York City's subway until riding Latin American ones. Nations with 1/5 our per capita GDP somehow have better systems than the rat-infested one in Gotham. They're not sleek like Asian ones, but are still clean, functional with bathrooms, retail, and 1 to 2 minute headways. Here's Santiago. Tell me about what you found out about rapid transit in Latin America.
Yeah, kind of expanding on the Argentina point there as well. I mean, because it's a constant in all of the Latin American cities to some degree. They have quite good mass transit. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is it's not as car oriented of a culture. Some of it is that people there have lower incomes, so they can't all afford cars and they have to use mass transit. But I think the cities and also to a degree the private sector have responded to this need. Go to any Latin American big city and or even the smaller ones, and you're going to see a huge kind of concentrated influx of not only municipal run rail and bus, but also just these little private buses that go around. And we use some of them. You know, you can pay 25 cents and get all over the city on these little private buses.
What an incredible experience. And I've seen several apartment buildings, condominium developments that you've taken picture of with lots of vegetation, lots of green walls.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's the Barrio Tropical concept at work. And so I think, you know, in one specific picture, I was talking about the way in which in the US, we build a lot of quote unquote podium buildings where we put parking at the ground level, and then we will build 4 or 5 stories of residential over that. And they're often very like nondescript. I would actually describe them as soulless buildings that use very cheap materials, even in well-off neighborhoods. But in Latin America, where a lot of the cities have, you know, 1/5 or 1/10 the per capita GDP of the US, they still manage to build much more beautiful buildings. And a lot of that just has to do with they use tropical vegetation. So I think that whichever management company is managing the building has made some sort of trade-off where they say, we're going to pay a little bit more to have tropical vegetation hanging from our building. And that presumably will make the building more attractive and have higher condo sales and higher rents.
It would appear that there's a lot of parks, a lot of vegetation. You know, in Toronto, I'm not sure about the United States, but when you want to develop a building, you have to give a parkland dedication. So it's government that's forcing vegetation, forcing parks. Are these forced by government, or are people just creating them?
Well, it's a combination. I don't think the government is forcing anyone to build a park. I think what happens is there's a lot already existing in the public realm. And a lot of that is the government building nice public spaces. But then I think the private sector, there's just there's a mindset that you add to the public realm as well, because that's what makes your building attractive and makes people want to enter it. There was even a phrase, I wish I could remember what it was in Spanish, but my cab driver in Quito, Ecuador was telling me about it because he has one of these himself, where specific households will build mini forests in their house or outside of their house. Like, for example, if you own a small home and you have a small front yard, you actually build a mini forest of trees and plants that looks way more elaborate than just your typical garden. And that's a way to make your house attractive. And so he said that in the nicer neighborhoods, it's almost like a status symbol to turn your front yard or your backyard or even like one of your balconies into a mini forest. And it's like a way even for different homeowners to compete with each other.
So I guess you've seen a fair amount of private sector involvement, both in startup cities as well as in development that you think actually does a better job than what we've got in North America? And in addition, governments are still playing an important role in creating great cities and in putting aside the green space and building efficient transit, et cetera. So what's the secret here? What's the difference? If both governments and private sector are doing a better job, what have you learned?
Well, I think it goes back to the cultural thing of just there's another example actually there of there was also just a lot of public art on building places. That's at the airport. Like, when's the last time you saw an airport that had a mural like that hanging from it? So I don't know. I think it's just there's more of a cultural sensibility towards having attractive public spaces that soothe people and that are calming and that make people want to visit a space. And I hear it's similar in Europe. I haven't traveled through Europe, so that'll be at a later time, and so I'll be able to compare everything by then. But I just know that from the perspective of comparing the U.S., which I'm quite familiar with and have traveled all through, to Latin America, it just seemed like there was more of a mindset that you need to develop the public realm. And it was just fascinating to me that in countries where, like I said before, they'll have 1/10 or even 1/5 of the GDP per capita, they somehow managed to build a better civic infrastructure than cities in the US that tend to just throw their funds away.
I met a developer in Dallas, Texas recently, who really made an interesting comment to me. He said, well, the new anchor is green space. Green space yes. is the new anchor. What do you think of that?
Well, he's picking up on something that I found a lot in LATAM, because that was the other thing that I wanted to say about the startup cities, is that I would say uniformly, of all 10 ones that I visited, and even in some specific ones, this was the sales pitch of the entire project, was this idea that they were going to reduce the amount. Let me mute myself real quick because the phone is ringing.
Sorry, what were you saying, Scott?
That was actually, so some of these master plan startup cities that I visited, the central sales pitch was in fact that they were going to create a safer public realm that had where the automobile cars were not allowed to speed and just kind of run the day. They were going to be deprioritized within the project in favor of the pedestrian, a safer experience for the pedestrian. And one specific project called Puerto Norte in Panama City, actually, like, the main pitch of the project was this idea that they were going to have a lot of street trees. And they were going to replicate this barrio tropical concept that I'm talking about, but fully run by the private sector. Like, basically the company was going to be the planner of the project, and they were going to replicate the barrio tropical concept. And they were going to use like 40 different tree species. Like each street was going to have a different species of tree going along it. So yeah, I mean, I think that what the Dallas developer told you is correct.
Green space is the new anchor. Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Scott Beyer in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Scott Beyer, who is the owner of the Market Urbanism Report. He's a journalist, he's a consultant, he's a public speaker, he's a free market urban policy analyst, and he's traveling for a year and a half through developing cities in Latin America, which he's just completed, and he's off this week to spend 6 months in South Africa, starting in South Africa, and then he's going to continue in the fall of 2023 in Asia. And so it's going to be interesting to check in with you on a couple of your trips. So we've talked a lot about just sort of the public realm and about green space and transit and things like that. But the other thing that you said was really interesting about your trip was startup cities. Take a step back and remind us all what a startup city is, why Latin America has a lot of them, and what you found out about them, if you could, Scott.
So a startup city is an alternative city that is run by a private company and that is for profit. In a lot of ways, you think a startup city is like a startup, which is just in the way that a startup is building a new product and getting capital to provide something new to the world. It's like that, but for a city. They're often, so I'm not talking about just standard HOAs here. I'm talking about planned communities that are doing something unique and look at themselves as like a competition to the existing urban order, which is government-run cities.
And so this example that you sent to me of Viva Park in Brazil looks like it's just outside of the city and it's just a big piece of dirt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is at this point. Viva Park is a development company that is trying to build a bunch of little 1 square mile cities all around Brazil. So there's like a Viva Park Portobello, and there's a Viva Park some other city. They're building a second one, and they want to build a lot of them. The idea being that a 1 square mile creates a blueprint for them to really control the situation and have their preferred environment. So Viva Park focused a lot on things like multimodal street design and public spaces. Every Viva Park is going to have multiple lakes for fishing and recreation, and then there's also a really heavy prioritization on security, because Brazilian cities are not safe, especially if you have money, and so they use like a lot of technology to have modern day policing.
And is this something that just the local regular cities just can't afford or can't do or don't do?
Well, I can say authoritatively that they don't do them. Why they don't do them, it's tough to say. But I mean, go into any Brazilian city or really any Latin American one, and there's just a lot of graffiti and there's a lot of drug activity and drug sales and theft. And so people just don't feel safe. And I think the Viva Park guy even said that like a lot of his clients are people who are Brazilian expats who live in the US and had to leave their country because they felt so unsafe. And now Viva finally giving them like an alternative that they could come back to and still live in Brazil while feeling safe.
So in and around the United States, you have numerous different master plan communities, Las Colinas or Irvine, California, Celebration in Florida and Central Florida. What's the difference between some of the master plan communities that have been developed in the United States versus what you're talking about?
Well, the 3 ones that you mentioned, I would define all of those as startup cities. Although Irvine, I think, switched to a public government at some point, so I don't know if it still quite fits that definition. But yeah, I mean, Las Colinas would be a good example. Where I think at least some of these startup cities would be more extreme and differ than the US ones is they have more autonomy. Like in some cases, they have their own special economic zone status that helps them just operate with full autonomy. But I think, like, for example, Cayala in Guatemala City, you didn't have the county coming in and telling them what kind of community they needed to build. And if you walk through it becomes very evident that like there was no regulation here other than the ones that the private developers wanted to have. Like there was no parking minimums, there was none of that. You could just tell. So that's what they themselves say, is that in these types of countries, it's very easy just to assemble land and build whatever you want. And the surrounding jurisdictional oversight is very minimal.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that democracy actually doesn't create good cities, or is it some democratic cities that have become overregulated don't create great cities?
Probably more the former. That I don't think the democratic system and the idea of having politics and politicization affect everything is necessarily a good model. That might be what some people want, but I think a lot of people just want to live in a functional community, and they don't necessarily want to be involved in voting and having to make political decision making. And so I think the promise of a lot of startup cities is that you're outsourcing a lot of the political and management decision making to actual managers who have the profit motive as their bottom line, but the profit motive, it seems, creates more attractive spaces and better management, better services.
Really, that's fascinating. So one of the issues that have been talked about in Toronto, Canada, of late, is that the minority that gets involved in democratic decision making in regards to zoning and building permits and things like that ends up being a very vocal, established minority, and it ends up subjecting their views on the majority that don't get involved, on the silent majority that don't get involved. And some people call it NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and because turnout in municipal elections is so low, and this minority is even a minority of that turnout, they end up having this outsized view, and it ends up stymieing a lot of development and a lot of growth and a lot of transit, et cetera. And it biases us toward just single family suburban sprawl rather than necessarily the kind of density that some people think we need. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And the only thing I would add to that is that a lot of times this vocal minority is not really paying for anything. Like they might pay taxes to some degree, but they have influence in the planning of the city that is not commensurate with the amount that they pay into the city. And so they're kind of like extracting demands and carve outs for themselves that you could almost call a form of rent seeking. Whereas I think the difference with a lot of these startup cities is that the central decision makers are the people who are developing the city, are financing the city, are paying into the system and actually making the city happen. And so it would be natural that they would be the ones who make decisions. And in fact, I would argue that their decisions are better because their own financial interests are at stake.
What do you think you're going to do with this trip?
Well, the long-term goal is to have better cities back in the U.S., and particularly in the startup city space. So I'm looking at different best practices that they are doing in the so-called developing world and saying, how can we apply these in the U.S.? I think that the startup city idea is ripe for experimentation in the U.S. and kind of to your earlier point, a lot of these have already gotten built, but I think there's much more that we can be doing, and I think it would be a very profitable venture to do in the U.S., particularly if we can start to get some of the. One thing the U.S. does not have is it doesn't have the autonomy that I was describing earlier, where some of these areas can become like special economic zones that are designed to attract businesses and capital. And we don't really have a very developed version of that in the US that would enable someone to like build a brand new type of city and have it be autonomous from federal taxation or state taxation. And so that I think is the next step in the startup city ecosystem for the US.
If you were I don't know what the equivalent would be, but Secretary of Housing or Secretary of something or other in the United States that was responsible for city development. What would you do? How would you change things?
Well, I would probably try to lobby for that. Just the idea that like because I mean, even communist China has had special economic zones and still does, and those have done quite well. And so I think it's kind of odd that as big of a landmass as the United States is, and as diverse of a culture as it is, that you couldn't have, say, a couple square miles that you could carve out in Texas that could have a completely different jurisdictional setup than the rest of the United States. It just seems it's kind of a controlling aspect of the US where they want to control everything, all of the land, and they can't allow any sort of autonomy within it.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute with Scott Beyer, who is on this 18-month world trip around the Southern Hemisphere, both South America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, to learn what the developing world can teach us about in regards to developing cities. Fascinating. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're focused on really Southern Hemisphere development, Latin American development, and Scott Beyer, who is the owner of an organization called Market Urbanism Report. He's on an 18-month trip around the Southern Hemisphere. He's just finished his 6 months in Latin America. And Scott, you've told us a couple of interesting concepts so far. One of them is these startup cities. And you talked about, and I guess they're sort of like master plan communities that you find in North America, but you've developed it. You've suggested it really is a great way of developing these new cities. You've talked about a lot of placemaking of far nicer developments in central areas, whether they be with a lot more vegetation, a lot more shopping, very vibrant, etc. And then you said there was a third one that you wanted to talk about. What's the third one?
And it's very different than the other two. The other two, that the Barrio Tropicals and the startup cities, for all their merits, I'd say they're catered more to the wealthy. The third one that I am very interested in is catered towards the non-wealthy, which there's huge social divides in Latin America, and so it's natural that the neighborhoods would be this different from each other, but they're all kind of interesting to me. And so that third one is favelas, or in Spanish-speaking countries, they're called barrios populares, kind of like populist barrio neighborhoods. And these are informal settlements. It's interesting. Something like 1/5 of the global population lives in informal settlements. And so the way this takes the dimension in Latin America is you'll often have state-run land, such as up on the mountainsides, that aren't really heavily managed, or there's not a lot of state capacity to turn them into anything. So you'll have these little migrant movements, like these populist movements, where migrants from the rural areas who are living in poverty will quote unquote invade, and that is in fact the local colloquialism in all of these countries is they'll call them invasions, where migrants will suddenly like invade into these publicly managed lands and just start building little encampments. But encampments is kind of it underrates the sophistication of these communities, because they often build, it's like people who are poor and lack education and lack resources nonetheless build these very complex urban neighborhoods.
And you're saying these are positive or negative?
Well, the negative part, to me, the most negative part about them is the fact that they are not structured on any sort of property rights system. So in some cases, they're taking other property that might either be state or in some cases privately run. And then there's not any sort of land titles that help structure the society in the neighborhood. But the positive of it, and particularly when it happens on state land, is it allows people who would not be able to join the system and join the city in any other way, still be able to live in proximity to good jobs.
So are these slums? Are they slums?
They are. They're called slums. They're called favelas, barrios populares, informal settlements. They exist in Africa. They exist in India. They're a global phenomenon.
And you think 1/5 of the world's population lives in them?
That's what's estimated.
But I guess what you're saying, and I keep on drawing this back to Toronto. One of the issues that we're dealing with is an affordability crisis, such that some people are calling it the Manhattanization of Toronto, where no one that's got a lower income can afford to live in the city. And what you're saying is that these developments allow lower income people to live close to jobs. So how do we solve this problem?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting parallel. So I think just the same, what you're looking at there is Tegucigalpa, Honduras. So that's the capital city. That image is actually very close to the best neighborhood in all of mainland Honduras, like where the U.S. embassy is, where the Chinese embassy is. So whereas in a typical Western context in the U.S. and Canada, poor people would not be able to live close to the nicest neighborhood in the country. In this case, they just all came in and invaded the mountainside, stretching for miles and miles and miles. And yeah, they built these communities. And so what it does is it helps the lowest income people who are living most on the margins still be able to build a life for themselves and housing for themselves in, or at least close to, good neighborhoods.
Okay, so what's your learning? That we should allow these illegal, unplanned squatters on lands close to rich neighborhoods, or that we should somehow make available more inexpensive housing in our downtowns?
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say that we should ditch all property rights and allow squatters' rights. So I'm not gonna say that. But I think there's a medium there where, what are the takeaways for the U.S.? It's tough to even say. I mean, I think the main takeaway is just that, yes, we should not have such standardized expectations out of our construction process that only rich people can be able to afford the construction, because a lot of what you're seeing in these photos of favelas is very makeshift, and they would never pass code in more standardized Western societies. But that's problematic for the West, because it just means that a large portion of the society can't afford housing close to jobs.
I think, Scott, that a lot of the findings that you've spoken about really do have a lot of relevance. And so thank you for going on this tour, and thank you for sharing your findings with us. I do like this idea of the green space as the new anchor. Your vegetation, your parks, your retail, your vibrant city centers. I think that is interesting. I really like the idea of the startup cities, master plan communities, and I think some of them have been some of the most successful developments that I've had the privilege of touring as I've traveled around North America. And I do think one of the biggest challenges we have is affordability, and it's general affordability, and I think that's caused by just a lack of development and NIMBYism and things like that. But some of it, you're quite right, is that we've got the standardized way of what we think is best for building, which makes it uneconomic for a large segment of society. And I'm not suggesting that we relax building codes, but I do think that whether it be modular housing or government providing land for free, or some other things that we should be thinking about. We need to be, Jane Jacobs did talk about this, that the best neighborhoods were mixed income neighborhoods, where everyone of numerous different income levels could live in close proximity to vibrant urban cores. And I worry that too many of our cities in North America are becoming places just for the rich. And as I mentioned, I think that we have that risk in Toronto with the quote unquote Manhattanization of Toronto, where anyone that is in any kind of a service economy job or not middle income or better needs to live way out of the city and spend an hour commuting, and that can't be the right solution for our cities. And so I really want to thank you for sharing some of your trip with us and some of your insights with us, and I look forward to hearing what you learn in Africa.
Thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday on 9:60 a.m. You can stream me online even from Latin America or Africa at www.saga960am.ca. On my podcast and videocasts are available on briancrombie.com. And Scott, if people want to check out your trip, what's the best way to do that? To follow you on Facebook or LinkedIn or your website, or what?
Many platforms, but I'd say the best one is the Market Urbanism Report Facebook group. And there you will get daily updates, little photo essays that I post that show the different things I'm discovering on the trip.
Scott Beyer, thanks so much for inspiring us. Good luck with your next leg.
Thanks.